Thank you for attending our webinar on understanding dyslexia. Know your child's educational rights in school on March 4th at 6:30 from Heather at McAndrews. Our disclaimer: the ARC of Lehigh, Northampton County's Advocacy Department does not employ lawyers nor provide legal advice. This training or any other provided by the ARC's Advocacy Department does not constitute or imply the endorsement, recommendations, or favoring of the providing party or any employers or contractors acting on its behalf. This webinar is being provided for educational and informative purposes only. Now it is my pleasure to introduce our guest presenter, Heather. She is a shareholder in the Scranton office, where she contributes her diverse educational professional background. She has been a member of the firm, lots of talking, since May of 1990. With 15 years of experience, she has a broad knowledge in the area of special education. In addition, she has an extensive background in the area of psychology, provided with her considerable understanding of students with learning differences. She has graduated from West Virginia University, Marywood University, Drexel University, and Villanova University School of Law. She definitely knows her educational information. Thank you for your time this evening. Enjoy, and Heather, the Zoom is yours.
Thank you so much, Cody, and thank you so much for having me. I'm so excited to be here. So I do definitely need to update my bio because it's about 20 years experience now.
Okay,
but thank you so much. I really appreciate you guys having me. And this topic is near and dear to me. And I also find it to be one of the my favorite topics to present on because we know so much about dyslexia. There's been tons and tons and years of research. We know what dyslexia is, and we know how to address it. We know what individuals with dyslexia need in order to learn how to read. People with dyslexia learn how to read differently than most people. So we're going to get into, I like to call this presentation, why aren't we talking about dyslexia and the IDA? And I'm sure a lot of you may have experienced this. I hear many of my clients, parents I work with, tell me that their school districts will frequently tell them, we don't test for dyslexia, or dyslexia is not something that we address. And that really could not be farther from the truth. We're going to get into the nitty-gritty of dyslexia and how to get your school district to address it. But I can tell you right off the bat, dyslexia is actually right in the Individuals with Disabilities Education Act. So the federal law that provides for school districts what they need to do to sufficiently evaluate students and how to provide them what's called a free appropriate public education. Dyslexia is right in the IDEA. So topics for discussion, major topics we're going to talk about are dyslexia as a disability under the Individuals with Disabilities Education Act, or the IDEA. We're going to talk about practical tips for advocating for students with dyslexia. And again, there's a whole lot of information that is embedded in those two major general topics. So first, just to go over a little bit about what dyslexia is, because I think that it's often misunderstood, fully at least. And I think it's important that we at least talk about what we mean when we talk about dyslexia. So information from what's called Millions Have Dyslexia, Few Understand It, which was published in November of 2016. It's common. Dyslexia is common. Most estimates in the United States put it at somewhere between 5 and 17% of the population. It's not seeing letters in the wrong order or getting B's and D's mixed up. It can be that. It's certainly students with dyslexia can mix up B's and D's and can get letters in the wrong order, but that's not what dyslexia actually is. That's more of a symptom of dyslexia. And it's much more than that. It's basically like looking at a foreign word. It would be like if I have learned how to speak English and I provided with a document that is written in Japanese, I would not be able to understand it. And that is essentially what it's like for people with dyslexia. Also, from Millions Have Dyslexia, Few Understand It, there's nothing wrong with their vocabulary. So they know what the word, for example, galloping means, and they can use the word in spoken English in 20 different ways, perhaps. They just can't read the word. So I want to make it clear that it's not a vocabulary issue, although it can impact vocabulary, and we're going to talk about how. People with dyslexia don't naturally process the written word. So most of us who learn to read through what's called a whole word approach, people with dyslexia don't process the whole written word. They don't easily break it into smaller units that can be turned into sounds and stitched together. So it's essentially, it's a phonological processing. Sometimes we hear the word phonics or decoding. So it's essentially struggling to sound out and decode the letters into their sounds. So that's why we will sometimes see the mix up of B's and D's and the mix up of letters. But the dyslexia itself is a phonological processing disorder. The International Dyslexia Association, just to give us a little more general background information and a little more understanding of dyslexia, defines dyslexia as a specific learning disability that is neurological in origin. It's characterized by difficulties with accurate and/or fluent word recognition. And what we mean by fluent is how quickly we can read that word, how quickly we can flow through that word and recognize what those sounds of the letters are. And by poor spelling and decoding abilities. So decoding is the phonics part. It's the sounding out of the letters into sounds and into words. And encoding, people with dyslexia also struggle with encoding, which is essentially spelling. So it's, I don't know if it's the opposite, but it's being able to take those sounds and put them into words. So these difficulties typically result from a deficit in the phonological component of language. It's often unexpected in relation to other cognitive abilities and the provision of effective classroom instruction. So very, very often, people who have dyslexia, students that have dyslexia, are bright. So it's not a cognitive deficit. Students who have dyslexia just have that, like I said, that phonological processing deficit. They're typically not students that miss school. So there's students that come to school that want to learn and have received the classroom instruction according to the regular education curriculum. Secondary consequences may include problems in reading comprehension and reduced reading experience, because oftentimes they don't like to read. It's a struggle. They don't read as much. And it can impede the growth of vocabulary and background knowledge. People with dyslexia, students with dyslexia, will often see that we might not necessarily see the full extent or say, wow, okay, I really know what's going on here, until about third grade. And this is not all the time, but this is just often because when you have students who are bright and who have a phonological processing or decoding deficit, but they can still put context cues together. So it would be like taking a document and blacking out all the words that they don't recognize, but they can still recognize some of the words. Lots of times it's from memorization, and they can put together the context clues to comprehend enough, especially at that kindergarten, first grade, second grade level. When we start to get into heavy reading, third grade is usually when we start to see those dyslexia deficits really come through in the educational system. Again, not like it can happen sooner, but it's not surprising to me when I had parents come to me and their children are about at the third grade level and they're really starting to understand what's going on. So recognizing signs, possible signs in students with dyslexia, because sometimes, again, especially at that kindergarten, first grade, second grade level, it might not be as clear. So some of the signs that we see are children who read slowly and almost painfully, that it's really a challenge for them to read, and it's again, it's almost, they're struggling so much that they really don't like it. They experience decoding errors, especially with the orders of letters. So you might see them take a word, and because they know the first letter, they might guess at the rest. So, if it starts with R, and they know that that the word refrigerator begins with R and it's a long word, they might guess refrigerator when it's really rhinoceros. Shows wide disparity between listening comprehension and reading comprehension. So students, again, we're typically talking about bright students. So if they are read something, or they're have to hear something in the classroom, they will be able to comprehend that. But then we see when it's in text and they have to read it, there's more of a struggle. You would typically see trouble with spelling in students with dyslexia, again, because it's that encoding, which involves the same skills. May have difficulty with handwriting, and we're going to talk a little bit about the overlap with dyscalculia and dysgraphia. So dysgraphia, sometimes when students struggle to form letters, it may be because they have dysgraphia, which often will be a comorbidity with dyslexia and or dyscalculia. Students with dyslexia will often exhibit difficulty recalling known words. So you may see them struggle with being able to recall those words. Again, it's partly language based as well. So you might see difficulty with written language also. So being able to write a paragraph, write a sentence, you'll see struggles with that. And students, again, dyscalculia is often a comorbidity with dyslexia. So you may experience difficulty with math computations as well, and being able to read numbers. And we'll talk a little bit more about that. Decoding real words is sometimes better than decoding nonsense words in students with dyslexia. And again, I'll explain that. So we're talking about bright students typically. And if they have recognized a word, they've seen it over and over again, they tend to know those words, they will be able to decode those words that they know. Again, sight word recognition comes into play a lot, memorization. So when we're testing students with dyslexia, we will often assess their decoding of nonsense words. So words that aren't really words. And that way we know that they're not using their memorization skills to be able to decode. And then you will often see students with dyslexia will substitute, they'll make those errors with one sight word for another. So there are sight words they recognize, but especially those smaller sight words like a, I, he, the, their, you might see them mix those up. So dyslexia and the IDEA, dyslexia as a disability. Again, we hear often that students with in an educational setting, school districts, charter schools will tell parents, we cannot address dyslexia. We cannot test for dyslexia. Parents will come and say, I think my child has dyslexia. Oh, well, we can't do anything about it. Go get a medical diagnosis, get a medical evaluation. So shocking, maybe to some, dyslexia is right in the IDEA. The IDEA, the federal law that we school districts must provide these services under, and its regulations both specifically use the word dyslexia. So it's, if you are having a meeting with your school district and you had them tell you that we can't address dyslexia, we can't test dyslexia, don't be afraid to bring a copy, print it out, right on, you can Google dyslexia in Individuals with Disabilities Education Act. When you get a copy of the PowerPoint presentation, you will have the citation you can type in and you can print it out and bring that to your next meeting. So right in the IDEA, the federal law, specific learning disability is defined, and there's two sections. So under section A, in general, the term specific learning disability means a disorder in one or more of the basic psychological processes involved in understanding or using language, spoken or written, which disorder may manifest itself in the imperfect ability to listen, think, speak, read, write, spell, or do mathematical calculations. Subsection B, disorders include, such terms include such conditions as perceptual disabilities, brain injury, minimal brain dysfunction, here we are, dyslexia, and developmental dysphagia. So dyslexia is right in the IDEA under the definition of specific learning disability. In the federal regulations, similarly, although it's more compacted, the federal regulations define specific learning disability as it's a disorder in one or more of the basic psychological processes involved in understanding or in using language, spoken or written, that may manifest itself in the imperfect ability to listen, think, speak, read, write, spell, or do mathematical calculations, including conditions such as perceptual disabilities, brain injury, minimal brain function, dyslexia, and developmental aphasia. The word dyslexia is not in the Pennsylvania Codes chapter about special education. However, Pennsylvania public schools must follow the federal IDEA and its regulations. So, under the IDEA, students are identified, and this is where I think school districts have missed the dyslexia in the IDEA. I don't think that they're intentionally, the people who are telling parents, oh, we don't test for dyslexia, I don't think they're intentionally misleading parents. I think they really do believe that the IDEA doesn't include dyslexia in it because they're focused on the categories of eligibility. So under the IDEA, there are categories where students fall under to be identified with special education services. And I'm going to read them to you. Autism, deafness, deaf-blindness, emotional disturbance, intellectual disability, hearing impairment, multiple disabilities, orthopedic impairment, other health impairment, specific learning disability, speech and language impairment, traumatic brain injury, visual impairment, including blindness. So those are the only disability categories that a student would be identified as a special education student under the IDEA. So that may be why school districts say, well, we don't address dyslexia as part of the IDEA. However, when I was reading the definition to you before, that was specific learning disability, which is one of the categories listed. So while they don't address dyslexia as a disability classification, they address dyslexia under the disability classification of specific learning disability. Okay. So again, what is a specific learning disability? It's a disorder in basic psychological processes. It's involved in understanding and using language and may manifest itself the imperfect ability to think, listen, speak, read, write, spell, or do mathematical calculations. There are 8 subcategories in which a student, when you are evaluated for special education and you're evaluated for, okay, one of these, or maybe more than one of the eligibility classifications that we just went over. So if we think this student has dyslexia, struggling in reading, we're thinking, okay, the students may qualify under the category of specific learning disability. Within that category, there are 8 subcategories which a student would be identified. So in the evaluation, when a school district completes it, if they identify a student with specific learning disability, it should say which, or could be more than one, it could be all of them, but which of the 8 subcategories. So there's oral expression, listening comprehension, written expression, basic reading skills, reading fluency skills, reading comprehension, math calculation, and math problem solving. A student with dyslexia may have, would most likely fall under, for sure, basic reading skill. So specific learning disability in a basic reading skill. So it's not a specific learning disability in phonological processing or decoding, but phonological processing or decoding are basic reading skills. So dyslexia would fall under that category of specific learning disability in basic reading skill. It may also be a reading fluency specific learning disability. Reading fluency is how quickly you read. So students, there are expectations for students at each grade level for how quickly, how many words correct per minute they should be able to read. If the student's dyslexia is impacting, which makes sense, it's probably going to impact their reading fluency skills, because if they're struggling to decode and sound out those words, they're not reading as quickly as they probably should be. So we may see a specific learning disability in reading fluency skills as well. Reading comprehension. So this is a may or may not. Sometimes we have students, and again, it may depend on their grade level. So you may not see a reading comprehension specific learning disability in kindergarten, first, second grade, but maybe by the time the student reaches third, fourth, fifth, you might just see that discrepancy. And we're going to talk about how to identify specific learning disability, but you're going to see that deficit in reading comprehension as well. So you may have a student with dyslexia who's identified with specific learning disability, basic reading skill, reading fluency skills, and math comprehension. Written expression may also be something that dyslexia is going to fall under that area of specific learning disability, because if the student's dyslexia, which very often it does, is going to impact the student's ability to write a sentence, write a paragraph, those are written expression skills. So they may also have a specific learning disability in written expression. Math calculations and math problem solving, again, could be a specific learning disability because of dyscalculia. So it might not be specific learning disability and dyscalculia, but it's the dyscalculia that's causing the specific learning disability in math calculations and math problem solving. So how are specific learning disabilities diagnosed? How do we identify students with a specific learning disability? So the state of Pennsylvania has adopted criteria that says, what may or may not be permitted in identifying students with specific learning disability. So the state of Pennsylvania does not require school districts and charter schools to use a severe discrepancy model. So that would be taking a student's cognitive abilities. So you have to do an assessment, an IQ test, and you assess their cognitive ability. And you're going to get several index scores. And most commonly, they're going to fall around the same place. Sometimes you have variability within that cognitive score, but so you have cognitive score, and then you compare it to the academic achievement. So that's where you'd assess the students' reading fluency skills, reading comprehension, reading decoding, math computation, math problem solving. And if the cognitive ability, so just to make it easy in terms of understanding, if we have a student who has an average cognitive score, 100 is dead average. So if we have a student that has an IQ of 100 and their reading, decoding is 72, that is a severe discrepancy between their ability and their achievement. We would expect a student with 100 IQ to be somewhere around 100. So there's one standard deviation from the mean is 15 points. So it used to be that school districts would almost universally use that 15-point discrepancy as an indication of a learning disability. Now schools have pushed it out to 2 standard deviations. So I think that's a little much. And I think most hearing officers would agree that it doesn't need to be that discrepant. But if you have a student that is not within, say, 12 points from the standard score, then you should start thinking, okay, there's a concern here. And certainly by 15 points or more, then we're seeing a discrepancy, at least one standard deviation below the mean. Another way that students can be identified with specific learning disabilities is through what's called a response to intervention model. And in Pennsylvania, school districts must be permitted with the use of using that sign. Basically, they use a tiered system. All students get research-based instruction, and they're on tier 1. They start out on tier 1. If there's indications that they're not making progress, okay, we're going to bump them up to tier 2. They're still not a special education student at this point. At that point, they start to provide a higher level of services, maybe a research-based program that's designed for students with reading deficits. Maybe they're going to get it in a smaller group for a portion of the day. It still might not be identified as a special education student. I will say that the large majority of school districts in Pennsylvania use a severe discrepancy model. In fact, I have not seen a school district in Pennsylvania use a true response to intervention model. They may use a tiered system, and we'll talk about that, but it's not a true response to intervention model, because with this true response to intervention model, there has to be progress monitoring over a certain period of time, and the tier, you can't stay in a tier for a year, which is what seems to be happening with this MTSS process. And we'll talk a little bit about that. But school districts, even if they're using the tiered system, they're still using a severe discrepancy model to identify students with specific learning disabilities. In Pennsylvania, schools are also permitted to use alternative ways to identify students with specific learning disabilities. So for example, if a child is not achieving adequately for that child's age, or they're not meeting state approved grade level standards in one or more of the 8 subcategories that we listed, even if they're not discrepant from their cognitive ability. So let's say and this typically would happen if you have a student who has a lower cognitive ability. So they may have an IQ of 82 and their reading, writing, and math skills are 70. So not that significant discrepancy, but we're still seeing low achievement scores, and we want to give them more support so that we can keep them up, especially because their cognitive abilities, they're going to need more support. So you will sometimes see students with specific learning disabilities being identified for those reasons, not as common as the significant discrepancy model, where you have students, school district conduct an evaluation, do a cognitive assessment, compare it to the academic achievement scores, also standardized, and determine that there's a discrepancy between the ability and achievement. Determining a specific learning disability in Pennsylvania, the Pennsylvania law, in the Pennsylvania code, a specific learning disability cannot be identified if it is the primary result of intellectual disability, a visual, hearing, or orthopedic disability, emotional disturbance, cultural factors, environmental or economic disadvantage, or limited English proficiency. So even if you have a significant discrepancy, if the schools can show that, well, there's limited English proficiency, or there's an intellectual disability or emotional disturbance, then they could argue that the student doesn't have a specific learning disability. The other thing in Pennsylvania that the code provides for is you cannot identify a student with specific learning disability if they have not received appropriate instruction in math and reading. So that does not mean, we know that students with dyslexia need a certain type of research-based program. That does not mean that because they didn't receive that they should not be identified with specific learning disability. It means that they haven't been provided with scientifically based instruction in the regular education setting, that they haven't received that instruction by qualified personnel. So maybe they didn't have a certified teacher. Maybe they didn't have the proper curriculum. Maybe they didn't come to school and didn't get the instruction. So those would be the reasons that a school could say, well, you know, we can't say it's a specific learning disability. When a school is evaluating a student for specific learning disability, there always has to be an observation of that student in the learning environment. So if you have a student that has not been identified with special education needs, we would want to get that observation in a regular education setting. We may want to get it in a regular education setting, even if they're already identified with special education needs. We want to document the child's academic performance and behavior in the areas of difficulty. If you have a student who you are assessing for specific learning disability that is less than school age, or not in a school environment, a in-person school environment, perhaps they're on cyber instruction, we must observe the school in an environment appropriate for that age. So if they're not in school, maybe they're attending preschool, and we want to evaluate them in a preschool setting. If they're in a cyber program, we can still observe in the home during the cyber instruction. Evaluation. So when we want a student, we want to get we believe our child has dyslexia, and we want to get them the support they need, the services they need, and the proper instruction in the school setting. We need to get them identified under the IDEA as a special education student. Again, it would fall under specific learning disability. Dyslexia would fall under that, and it would be whatever areas there is the need. Initial evaluations must be sufficiently comprehensive to identify all of the student's special education and related services needs, whether or not commonly linked to the disability category in which the child has been classified. So let's say we think the child has a reading disability, and we do academic achievement testing, and we find out that there's a discrepancy in math. We would still continue to assess and identify a student with a math disability. Or if we started to see during that evaluation, when we're doing academic achievement assessment, sometimes as part of that academic achievement assessment, there's areas of listening comprehension and oral expression, and the student may be struggling. Oh, okay, as a school psychologist, I may need to, there's scores that are low in these areas of language. Let's refer the student for a speech and language evaluation. So even though the child didn't come in as, okay, we think this child has a speech and language need, if we start to see that, if the school psychologist or whoever's completing that evaluation starts to see those concerns, then they need to evaluate all of the students' needs. It's important to know that when they're conducting an evaluation, especially when we think about dyslexia, we want to make sure that all of the needs that we think are concerns are evaluated so we can identify the need. So again, not all, you don't always see reading comprehension. So let's say the school district does academic achievement assessment, and the subtests you see listed are word reading, vocabulary, sight word recognition, reading comprehension, and you see, oh, the scores are they're fine. They're consistent with the cognitive ability. But you know that your child is struggling to read. When you listen to them read at home, they can't sound out words. They're, misspelling words. They're, saying words that they're going by the first letter. You need to make sure that the district's evaluation has assessed that area of need. So have they assessed decoding or phonological processing? Because just because they do academic achievement testing doesn't mean they're going to include the subtests that actually assess the area of need. So it's really important to understand, when we're talking about dyslexia, you should see decoding or phonological processing. Spelling should be evaluated for students. Sometimes they'll leave out the spelling assessment in the academic achievement. You want to see all of those areas assessed, because that's where you're going to typically see the dyslexia need show or be demonstrated. The district has 60 days excluding the summer. So summers don't count, but they have 60 calendar days from when they receive a parent's consent to do an evaluation. So you have to check that box. They issue a permission to evaluate. You check the box, you sign it. And once they receive it, then the 60 calendar day starts running, but summers do not count. Also important when thinking about evaluating a student with possible dyslexia. Evaluating students for special education need is not just academic needs. I think you all can understand that when I went through the classifications. So some things to think about when you're evaluating a student with dyslexia. Yes, we want to get that academic achievement assessment, but again, thinking about, is there a speech and language component as well? Because there's oftentimes you will see, sorry about that. There's oftentimes where you will see that a student with, a student with dyslexia will also have a speech and language need as well, because there is a language component to dyslexia. Also, students with dyslexia are at a higher risk for low self-esteem. Statistically, we see students with dyslexia who struggle with their self-worth and their self-esteem. So it's important to make sure that we're assessing that aspect as well, to, especially if we think that's an area of need. And I'll tell you why I think that is. Again, with students with dyslexia, we're often dealing with bright students. As they're moving through the grades, they see their peers, their same age peers, getting it, being able to read through that whole word approach. And they start to see themselves really not getting it and struggling. And they might work even harder than their friends, but they just can't get it through that whole language approach. And it can really start to do a number on their self-esteem. And they start to feel like, you might hear students with dyslexia say things like, I'm stupid, or, I just can't get this. So we want to be cognizant of that as well. Reading programs are built to ensure success. Students with dyslexia who receive the appropriate research-based programs will help to alleviate or address that concern. Because once they start getting what they need and they start learning how to read the way that they need to learn how to read, you will typically see their self-esteem increase. So going back to when we talked about the identification of specific learning disability, I just want to add this into the evaluation piece, because sometimes you hear this from schools. So they're not doing a response to intervention model per se. It'll be a tiered system, and they'll call it a multi-tiered system of support, so MTSS. This will often delay the evaluation process, because again, they have students that they're in tier 1, they're not making progress, let's move them into tier 2, they get a little bit more support, and it isn't until they get to tier 3 and they don't do well in that third tier that, okay, let's send them for an evaluation. Know that your school district, if you believe your child needs a special education evaluation, that MTSS system should not be delaying the initial evaluation process. Put your request in writing for an evaluation. The district has to respond to that. Typically, they will respond with a permission to evaluate, and they'll evaluate the student. If they deny your request for an evaluation, and I would put in your request, so when you put it in writing and you ask for an initial evaluation, tell them why, tell them the concerns that you have. My child is struggling to sound out words. I think they have dyslexia. If they deny that request, they have to issue what's called a notice of recommended educational placement, indicating that they're denying your request for an evaluation. And at that point, you should reach out to someone like myself, because we would file for due process, and they tend to back down, because in the case where they refuse to evaluate, that's an issue before a hearing officer. I can tell you this, it doesn't happen often. It does not happen often that school districts will refuse to evaluate. They will typically complete an evaluation of your child. Whether that evaluation is sufficient is the question. Students with disabilities must be located, identified, evaluated. Any student that is reasonably suspected of having a disability, school districts have that obligation. So yes, while you have the right and you can make a request for an evaluation, the obligation to evaluate and identify special education students is on the district. So even if a parent does not make that request, and there's evidence to show that the child was struggling, and here's, reasonably suspected of having a disability, it's what's called child under the IDA, and that could be a violation of the IDA if they did not timely evaluate. This includes students who are in private schools. So if your child's in private school and you believe they have an evaluation or disability, you can ask your public school district to evaluate. If your public school district has contact with your child, the child find obligation is there. Hearing officers will tend to find that they have to have at least some knowledge of them. Either they're transporting the student or you've let them know the student is in the private school. It would also include students who are experiencing homelessness. And the standard is whether the district knew there was an issue or should have known there was an issue. If a school district has not sufficiently, or if you believe your school district has not sufficiently evaluated your child's needs. So maybe they did the academic achievement assessment, but they didn't do phonological processing or decoding. Maybe they didn't even do academic achievement assessment. Maybe they didn't do, there was indications that there might be a speech and language impairment. They didn't go further. You can disagree with the evaluation and request an independent educational evaluation. That would be requesting the district to pay for an independent educational evaluation. So someone who is not affiliated, not employed by the school district to complete that evaluation. If it's if we're looking at it needing a psychoeducational evaluation, that would be completed by a certified school psychologist. If it's a speech and language evaluation deficit, that would be completed by a speech and language pathologist. If it's an occupational therapy concern, that would be completed by an occupational therapist. So it really works like a second opinion. And a district, if you make that request, which you should do in writing, or contact someone like us to help you with that process. And I should mention that our office takes most cases at no cost to families. So just keep that in mind. And I will say, oftentimes, even if a parent makes a request for an independent educational evaluation, first of all, you may not be aware of all the areas that you need to be asking for that independent evaluation. And also, districts tend not to give attorneys as hard a time as they might give a parent. So give you an example. When you request an independent educational evaluation under the IDA, under the law, a school district has two ways to respond. They can either agree to the request and say, okay, who would you like to use for the independent evaluation? Or they can request a due process hearing. And then they would have the burden to prove that their evaluation sufficiently evaluated your child. What they will sometimes do, especially with parents, is you request an independent evaluation and they'll come back and say, oh, what do you think we need to do? We'll go ahead and do that. They issue another permission to evaluate, to do some more testing, and parents will sometimes go ahead and sign that. And let them get really a second bite at the apple. So, or they'll say, oh, okay, well, we'll agree to your independent evaluation. Here's a list of independent evaluators. And maybe those people on that list are okay, but maybe not. So, you should know that if they do agree to fund an independent educational evaluation, you do not have to agree to those people on the list. And once you get an independent educational evaluation, the law says that a school district or local educational agency must consider, they don't necessarily have to agree with or adopt the results of the IE. However, if they have done an evaluation and it did not sufficiently evaluate the student, so let's say they did not do decoding, phonological processing, spelling, and those are the areas that are of need. You go, you get the independent educational evaluation, they agree to it, you get it. The independent evaluator does all those, assesses all those areas, and comes back and says, yes, there's a concern, this child has dyslexia. Here's, here's the data to prove it. They're going to be hard pressed to say, oh, we don't agree with that. Because again, you didn't do it, they did it, here's the data. So getting a good, strong, independent evaluation tends to help get a better educational program for your child. The Department of Education Office of Special Education and Rehabilitative Services offers some guidance as well. And this is great because it's just more support for dyslexia being addressed. So there is what's called a Dear Colleague letter. And this was all the way back in October 2015. That letter from the Department of Education, again, Office of Special Education and Rehabilitative Services, that goes out to all the school district personnel. It clarified that dyscalculia, dysgraphia, and dyslexia are all conditions that could qualify a child as a child with a specific learning disability under the IDEA. So not only do we have it in the IDEA already, we have the Department of Education reinforcing that. Just to give you a little background information on dyscalculia and dysgraphia, so we have a good understanding of what that means. Dyscalculia will generally affect the ability to understand numbers and learn math facts. Some of the signs you're going to see are poor comprehension of math symbols. So you may see them struggle with multiplication versus addition, difficulty memorizing and organizing numbers, telling time and counting. Dysgraphia, so that's going to have to do with the handwriting and forming of letters. It will affect handwriting ability and fine motor skills. So some of the signs you may see are illegible handwriting, inconsistent spacing. So we might have a student that writes all their words together, so it looks like one big long word. Poor spatial planning on the paper. So it may be that we have large going into small, poor spelling, difficulty composing writing, difficulty thinking and writing at the same time. So those are all signs of dysgraphia. And again, this guidance, this Dear Colleague letter, is just another great reminder to districts that we can speak in terms of dyslexia, and it is okay to say the word dyslexia and to include the word dyslexia, dyscalculia, or dysgraphia in the IDEA. And again, information about the specific condition, dyslexia, dyscalculia, dysgraphia, is also really helpful in being able to properly and sufficiently evaluate the student and ultimately be able to understand their needs and program for those needs. Lessons from hearing officers. So this is always a really interesting part that parents tend to like. How do the hearing officers, so when school districts say, we can't address dyslexia, we don't do that, how are the hearing officers viewing dyslexia? So there was a hearing officer decision by Hearing Officer Ford. And again, you're going to get all this information and citations. Where the IEP itself did not mention dyslexia. So the school district did not put the diagnosis of dyslexia in the student's IEP. The hearing officer wrote, though, dyslexia is not a separate disability category under the IDEA. However, the symptoms of dyslexia do not follow from a single condition. The many forms of dyslexia may have similar presentations, but are not all remediated in the same way. Without careful evaluation, it is impossible to select programming for a suspected dyslexic student. So that's great. The hearing officer also, the district was obligated to evaluate when the teacher suspected dyslexia. He wrote the district's lack of effort in this regard is concerning, as the recommendation to seek an evaluation from a doctor. So again, I'm sure some of you have heard, you've got to go get an evaluation from your doctor. And the hearing officer said, it is the district's obligation to evaluate the student. It is not the parent's obligation to obtain an evaluation when the district suspects the student may have a previously undiagnosed disability. So that if a district's telling you you need to go get a diagnosis or an evaluation from an outside source, that is wrong. False. And there's other hearing officer decisions that say this as well. So another hearing officer decision, the hearing officer talked about reading and dyslexia specifically. District instructed student in reading, his extreme area of weakness, by using teachers who have never taught dyslexic students, who this year are not special education teachers and who are not using a systematic, scientifically based multisensory approach to teaching students to decode and improve his fluency. So the hearing officer found a problem with a student who had dyslexia being taught by teachers who had no experience with teaching students with dyslexia, who were not using a systematic, scientifically based multisensory approach to teaching students to decode and improve their fluency. A third hearing officer decision. In this one, the evaluation was noted that while students' reading comprehension skills were getting stronger, so again, we know that sometimes that can happen, he applied so much effort to decoding that he often lost the meaning of the text. So you can see this sometimes with students with dyslexia, again, those bright students that may be able to comprehend to an extent, but if they're struggling so much to decode that by the time they get to the end of the sentence or the paragraph, they've lost the meaning, that's a problem. And that's going to affect their reading comprehension as well. So the hearing officer said inexplicably, the school district did not try something different. Instead, the school district steadfastly stuck to its same old ineffective programming. He rejected the school district's suggestion that that this student in particular with his severe dyslexia cannot achieve at a rate faster than he has demonstrated while at the district. So that's really important too, because I've heard this as well. School districts will say, well, he has dyslexia. He's not going to make progress that other students will make. Wrong, wrong, wrong. If students with dyslexia are provided the appropriate research-based instruction to address their decoding and phonological processing needs, they should absolutely be able to make progress consistent with their cognitive ability and their same age peers. So please don't let them tell you that your child's always going to struggle in reading. Lessons from the hearing officer. So just to take some takeaways from those decisions. Hearing officers do use the term dyslexia. The eligibility is based on specific learning disability, as we went over. However, we're not afraid of that word dyslexia, and hearing officers aren't either. Districts need to evaluate when they suspect a disability and cannot ask a family to get the evaluation. Really, really important. Teacher expertise matters. So if we're using a research-based program that requires the teacher to be certified in that program, then they need to be certified in that program. The type of program matters. So if you have a student who has dyslexia and needs a phonological decoding, phonics-based, research-based program, we should not be giving them a program that focuses on fluency. It's not going to work. data matters. So, when a school district is using a program, does the program have built-in progress monitoring? We should be using that for data. Be careful if they're using things like Ames-Web curriculum-based assessments, because Ames-Web are, first of all, they're very brief assessments. They're given to all students, regular education and special education students, and they do not, you're not going to have an accurate assessment of phonics, decoding, phonological processing. They have reading comprehension, Ames-Web, which, let me tell you what it is. It's paragraphs where the child is to read, and then there's one of 3 words that they fill in a blank. So if you're a bright student with dyslexia, you're going to be able to figure out which word goes in that blank. And believe me, the other 2 words don't make any sense. So again, we don't want to be using, if they're progress monitoring your students' IEP goals, make sure they're progress monitoring in an appropriate way where we're actually measuring what the students' needs are, and we're doing it in using an effective progress monitoring tool. Again, the best way to do it is, for example, if they're implementing Wilson reading program, Wilson has its own built-in progress monitoring. At the end of progress is going to be the centerpiece. So what is it that we're trying to do here? We're trying to make sure that students are provided with a free, appropriate public education, a program that's reasonably calculated to provide meaningful educational benefit in light of the student's intellectual potential. So if we have a student that's bright cognitively, we want to provide a research-based program that addresses the deficits due to the dyslexia. That's going to provide that student with FAPE. So specially designed instruction is the key. So when we're talking about students with IEPs, what makes a student, a special education student with an IEP, different than a regular education student? They're getting specially designed instruction, specially designed to address their specific need. So again, we want to make sure that we're addressing that. If we have a student with dyslexia, we're addressing that phonological processing and that decoding need. The program should be based on peer-reviewed research, so we should know it works, and it has to be implemented. The IDA says that it has to be implemented to the extent practicable. I would argue that when is it not practicable? Now, especially for dyslexia, again, this is an area, a deficit we've done tons of research on. We know what programs work. We know what needs to happen. So how is it not practicable to provide the research-based program that's needed? And so just one thing to touch on, because sometimes parents will get hung up on this, and school districts are real quick to tell you, well, we don't have to put the name of the program in the IEP. They're right. They don't. They do not have to say we're providing Wilson or we're providing an Orton Gillingham based program. They have to describe the type of program. So a research-based, phonics-based program. So don't get hung up if they won't put Wilson, if the child's getting Wilson into the IEP, as long as they describe that program accurately. Little recap: eligibility, specific learning disability includes dyslexia. No rule against using the term dyslexia in evaluations or IEPs. And appropriate evaluations must be sufficiently comprehensive. And when we're talking about specific learning disability, must include an observation. And we have to provide a free, appropriate public education. So some tips for a successful IEP meeting: prepare. Gather and review all documents in advance. Ask for drafts in advance. If your district is offering an invitation to an IEP, send them back the invitation and say, may I please get a a draft copy of the IEP in advance of the meeting. Make sure you have progress monitoring reports when you go to that meeting. Ask them how they're progress monitoring. Understand, ask questions. Don't be afraid to ask questions. How are you progress monitoring? How is this progress monitoring the need of decoding? Share any outside evaluations that may help with IE team in advance. So if you have some evaluation that gives information about your child's dyslexia or about your child's needs, certainly share that with the IEP team and do that in advance. It helps. So you can actually, because if you bring it to the meeting, they're going to say, okay, we'll have to review this. Bring a list of questions. And again, don't be afraid to ask questions, even if you're uncomfortable. This is not a comfortable process oftentimes. So it's hard. I know that. You have a whole bunch of people at the table. They're all saying the same thing. They're all sticking together, and you got you. So, don't be afraid to bring those lists of questions and ask those tough questions. And you'll start to see they get uncomfortable when you ask those tough questions and they don't have answers. Request assessments. It's okay to disagree with the evaluation. Consider that you may be entitled to an independent evaluation and make that request. Look at the evaluation. Did it omit areas of need? Ask about the results if you don't understand them, or if you feel that it's not an accurate reflection of your child. Don't be afraid. Again, with reviewing that progress monitoring, make sure that your child's being monitored appropriately and that the goals are changing from one IEP to the next. If you start to see, that we have the same goal from one IEP to the next, then your child's not making progress. That's a big red flag. Does the data from the progress monitoring match up with the goal itself? So again, you have to be real, you have to look at what are they measuring and how is it actually measuring what the goal says? And are we where we should be? So if your child started out the school year with a year gap between their ability and achievement, and at the end of the school year, that gap is widening, you are not where you should be. That gap should not be widening. It should be closing if they're providing the appropriate research-based instruction. Which brings me to understanding your research-based reading program. So know what kind of research-based programs are going to work for students with dyslexia. Wilson, Orton Gillingham. There's several other ones out there that Linda Bell has some programs, Barton has some programs. So Wilson and Orton Gillingham are probably the two biggies because they've been around and tons of research has been done. And the publishers are very clear about how many minutes per day. Make sure that IEP reflects what the research-based program. So if Wilson says your child should be getting 45 minutes of direct instruction a day in a small, what we call homogeneous group. So that's also really important. Making sure that if your child's getting that research-based instruction in a group setting, that they're in a group small, first of all, so maybe 5 or 6 students, and that all those students, what we mean by homogeneous, they're all working on the same thing on the same level. So we're not going to put a group, with one child's working on a 5th grade level, one child's working on a 7th grade level. We got this child who's got decoding needs, this child who's got fluency needs. No, they all should be working on the same thing on the same level. Does the IEP say so? What does it talk about in terms of how many minutes, how frequently, 45 minutes a day, small homogeneous group. Don't be afraid to check the provider's website. So if you have Wilson or Gillingham, go to the Google it, and you'll find information about what the recommendations are. Where is the instruction occurring? So making sure it's occurring in an appropriate location. So they're not in the back of the regular education classroom at a small table, that they're actually in a, either a learning support classroom or a small classroom just for those students. Certifications of the teachers. So if you're using Wilson, sometimes school districts will say, oh, our teacher is certified in Wilson, but they're not fully certified. So you can go for a weekend and get a certification, but it's not that is not the full certification that teachers should be, teachers who are implementing Wilson should have. They should be fully certified. So don't be afraid to ask those questions. Is the teacher fully certified in Wilson? And then are there other areas? Let's see here. Ideas for programs. So just some other ideas for the IEP. Okay, so again, we want a research-based reading and writing program, providing a quiet area for activities like reading, answering comprehension questions, maybe using books on tape, using books with large print or big spaces between lines, providing copies of lecture notes ahead of time, not counting spelling errors on things like history, social studies, science, other similar tests, allowing alternative forms for book reports, allowing the use of laptop or other computers for in-class essays, using multi-sensory teaching methods, teaching students to use logic rather than rote memory, and in presenting materials in smaller units. So a couple of these things to keep in mind when we're using things like books on tape or providing lecture notes or not counting spelling. These are accommodations rather than specially designed instruction. And they're to help a student. So we're not punishing them for their disability. So we're making sure that they get what they need. But at the same time, that should not, we should still be providing the research-based reading program or writing program that the student needs. So those accommodations should not be in place. So, oh, the student has a reading disability, let's make sure we have books on tape and we read the test questions to them. Again, that's only to help them out while they're getting that research-based reading instruction to help them actually learn to read. So we don't want to provide those accommodations in place of, we just want to provide them in conjunction with, so we're making sure that they're actually getting the proper instruction so they can learn to read, but while they're learning to read, they're not falling further behind. Okay. I did have a few pre-submitted questions that I wanted to go over, and I probably touched on some of this, but there were some pretty specific questions, very good questions, by the way. So the first one is, if it's not dyslexia, what are some common differentials that parents can explore, and how does dyslexia and apraxia of speech intersect? So again, remember that even if it's dyslexia, it's going to fall under the eligibility category of specific learning disability. And apraxia, which it absolutely intersects with dyslexia frequently. So students with dyslexia will often have apraxia and vice versa. And I will often obtain a neuropsychological evaluation and speech and language evaluation when I suspect there might be that intersection. I also will often put those two evaluators in contact with each other. So just so everybody knows too, apraxia is a speech sound disorder. So you can see how that can be intersect with dyslexia, which is a phonological disorder. So students that have apraxia will have trouble saying what they want to say correctly. So it comes out more verbally. So, but you can see how that, that speech sound disorder can often intersect with that phonological processing disorder with dyslexia. So students who have trouble reading or phonologically processing the sounds of letters and words, and then apraxia students struggle with the speech sound disorder. Okay. Next question, how to ensure child gets appropriate type and amount of reading intervention with fidelity, and how to improve effects on speech and language and math too. So I think we talked a lot about this. Again, the programming is based on the needs, and those needs should be determined by a sufficient evaluation. And that's why it's really important to get it right. And you may need to get an independent educational evaluation. So, like I said, if your school district completes a reading assessment but leaves out that decoding subtest or assessments of phonological processing, nonsense word fluency, again, areas that you're going to see those characteristics of dyslexia, that would be a reason to request an independent evaluation. And as the district, if the district did not sufficiently evaluate the student's needs, then you're going to get that independent evaluation. Once we know there is a phonological processing, phonics, or decoding issue, we know that the student needs a phonics-based, research-based reading program. So we know that they're going to need something like Wilson or Orton-Gillingham-based programming. In terms of effects on speech and language, same as what we just talked about with apraxia, you're going to want to get a speech and language evaluation. And if the school district speech and language evaluation is not sufficient, you may need to request an independent speech and language evaluation. And let me just touch on this real quick because I see this a lot. School districts will do a speech and language evaluation and it'll look like they did. Oh, there's an expressive language assessment, there's a receptive language assessment. You really want to Google what assessments they use, because you will often find out. So for example, there's an expressive one-word vocabulary test, and they'll say, oh, we evaluated your child's expressive language needs, we use this test. That test is literally what it says. It's an expressive one word. The child only has to respond with one word. They look at pictures and they respond with one word. That is not a sufficient evaluation of expressive language. So just, keep those kinds of things in mind. Do your research. With regard to math, if it is dyslexia that's impacting the math. So if it's a reading dyslexia disability, you will likely see problems with the word problems in math. However, if it's dyscalculia, you will see issues with comprehending numbers as well, comprehending signs. You're going to see more problems with the math itself. Third question that was pre-submitted, is it necessary to get a dyslexia diagnosis? So now again, if your school district is telling you, you have to go get a dyslexia diagnosis, no, that is not something. They should be evaluating your child for needs. And if your child has dyslexia, they can say that. Again, they're going to identify under specific learning disability, but you don't have to go get a diagnosis. What changes if you have the diagnosis? In terms of addressing the needs, nothing should change, because if they're doing a sufficient evaluation and we find out that the student has those decoding deficits, those phonological processing deficits, we address those needs. So it really shouldn't matter. However, it sometimes can be helpful to get a more specific understanding of the child, especially if we're talking about a student that has double dyslexia, for example. If we have a more comprehensive evaluation to give us that information, it can help really target what types of programs can address this child's need. So I believe that I've covered. Any other questions I'm happy to answer, but I believe I covered a lot of information, a lot of ground, and I don't mean to make your head spin.
No, thank you so much for that information. That was definitely wonderful. And I thank you for answering those pre-submitted questions as well. I'm going to end the recording so we can answer the rest of the questions in the Q&A. So thanks again.